The forbidden discovery. The winds of X09 howled across the barren, rust-colored landscape, carrying with them fine dust that had never known human footprints until now. The planet, located in the farthest reaches of the Andromeda frontier, was still in its infancy as a potential colony for humanity. 50 years of slow, patient terraforming had allowed for a breathable atmosphere, yet the land remained unpredictable, resisting full control. Commander Elias Carter took a steady breath, his oxygen mask filtering the last remnants of residual contaminants from the air. He adjusted the straps of his exosuit, the advanced polymer plating designed to protect against environmental hazards reflecting the dim light of X09's twin suns. Behind him, a group of researchers followed cautiously, their footsteps crunching softly against the alien soil. This mission wasn't just another routine survey. It was something more. For decades, Earth's expansion into the stars had been fueled by necessity rather than luxury. Resources had been depleted, old colonies struggled under their own weight, and humans had reached a tipping point, either find new, habitable worlds or face extinction. X09 had been a long shot, a planet marked as semi-viable by preliminary scans. Its ecosystem was rich but peculiar, harboring life forms that refused easy classification. Elias turned his gaze toward Dr. Sienna Holt, the team's lead biologist, as she knelt beside a patch of iridescent, bulbous growths that sprouted from the cracked ground. The plants pulsed ever so faintly, their glowing blue spores releasing a vapor-like mist into the air. "Commander," Sienna called out, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and suspicion. "You might want to see this." Elias stepped forward, kneeling beside her as she ran a biometric scanner over the strange organisms. The device hummed softly, processing data at lightning speed, but the results that flashed on the display were impossible. "These spores," Sienna muttered, tapping the screen. "They contain complex amino acids, structures that resemble proteins found in terrestrial life." Elias frowned. "Are you saying they could be edible?" Sienna hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "Not just edible. If these readings are right, they could be nutrient-dense, potentially even superior to anything we've cultivated on our previous colonies." The implications were staggering. Humanity had spent years engineering synthetic food sources, relying on lab-grown proteins to sustain off-world populations. If X09's natural vegetation could be integrated into human diets, it would change everything. "I don't like this," muttered Lieutenant Jess Monroe, the team's security officer. His hand rested lightly on the grip of his plasma rifle, a habit he had developed from years of working on unstable worlds. "I've seen this in too many horror vids. Weird glowing plants. It's never just food." Elias smirked. "No one's eating anything yet, Monroe." Jace grunted, still eyeing the glowing fungi with suspicion. From behind them, Dr. Callum Rice, the team's xenobotanist, joined the conversation. "You're all missing the bigger question," he said, adjusting his visor as he crouched beside the sample. "How did something so biologically familiar evolve on a completely alien world?" The group fell silent. Sienna's brows furrowed. "That's the part that worries me the most. There are certain genetic markers here that look engineered." Elias' head snapped toward her. "You think this was planted?" "I don't know," she admitted, scanning the fungi again. "But I do know that evolution doesn't tend to follow shortcuts. This stuff evolved too perfectly to fit our needs." Elias stood, scanning the vast landscape beyond their landing zone. The terrain stretched endlessly, a patchwork of jagged rock formations, rolling hills, and winding canyons. Something felt off, not in an immediate danger sense, but rather an unease buried in his gut. "Bag the samples," he ordered. "We'll analyze them back at the base." The research begins. Back at Echo Base, the research facility stood monolithic against the alien horizon. Constructed from reinforced alloys and fitted with advanced terraforming systems, it was one of the most sophisticated extraterrestrial labs humanity had built to date. The transparent domes that surrounded the central structure allowed for controlled agricultural testing, though most efforts had been met with limited success. Inside, the sterile glow of lab lights illuminated the facility as Sienna, Callum, and the rest of the research team prepared their samples. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, every scientist feeling the weight of what could be a revolutionary discovery. Elias entered the main research chamber, where Sienna had already begun the preliminary tests. She glanced up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, tapping on her console. Elias crossed his arms. "What doesn't?" Sienna pointed at the magnified image of the fungal spores displayed on the holoscreen. At first glance, they looked like ordinary biological structures: cellular walls, protein layers, the usual formations expected of an alien plant life form. But then Elias noticed it. The patterns. Deep within the cell walls, beneath layers of organic material, there were structured sequences. Repeating sequences. Almost like code. Elias' breath caught in his throat. Sienna turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Commander, I think this might have been designed." A heavy silence filled the lab. The weight of that revelation settled over them like an unseen force, shifting the entire trajectory of their mission. Because if something on X09 had been designed, then the next question was obvious. By who? And more importantly, the unsettling truth. The hum of the research station's lab filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional beep of scanning equipment. Outside, the twin suns of X09 had dipped low on the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and deep violet. Inside the sterile white walls of Echo Base, however, a very different kind of light flickered. Data projections, pulsing holograms, and magnified images of something that shouldn't exist. Commander Elias Carter had been on dozens of deep space missions, encountered everything from hostile weather systems to rogue AI failures, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The fungal spores, the ones that glowed faintly in the dim light of the lab, were engineered. Designed. For what purpose? By who? Dr. Sienna Holt hadn't spoken in several minutes, her eyes scanning and rescanning the molecular data flashing across her console. Every time she ran an analysis, the same result appeared: a repeating genetic sequence embedded in the spores, too deliberate to be a natural phenomenon. Elias finally broke the silence. "How sure are you?" Sienna turned, her eyes serious. 99.9%. Maybe higher. The structure of these spores is too perfect. Natural evolution doesn't leave patterns this precise. This, intentional. Lieutenant Jace Monroe, who had been standing by the lab entrance, exhaled sharply. "So what are we saying here? That someone, or something, planted these spores." "That's exactly what we're saying." Callum Rice, the xenobotanist, chimed in. He leaned forward, tapping a few keys on his terminal. "And there's more. These things don't just have protein structures similar to Earth-based organisms. They mirror some of our own DNA coding." Elias frowned. "Explain." Callum hesitated, then brought up a comparative DNA model between the spores and a baseline human genome. The similarities were disturbing. "I compared the sequencing." Callum continued, enlarging the projection. "These spores contain fragments of coding similar to human gut microbiota. Not exactly human DNA, but close enough to suggest." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Suggest what?" Elias pressed. Callum looked at him. "That whoever, or whatever, made these spores knew what humans needed to survive." The words hit the room like a shockwave. Jace let out a low whistle. "That's impossible." Sienna shook her head. "No, it's not. But it is deeply unsettling. A food source, or something else. The implications of their discovery hung over them like a storm cloud. If these spores had been engineered for human consumption, then the next logical question was why. Were they meant as a gift, a test, or something more sinister? Elias straightened, his tactical mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. What about toxicity levels? Sienna exhaled. We ran the initial toxicity scan. Nothing dangerous. At least, nothing obvious. In fact, the spores break down in a way that suggests they'd be highly digestible. Elias narrowed his eyes. So you're saying we could eat this stuff? Callum hesitated. Not just that. It might actually be beneficial. The protein structure is highly efficient, better than anything we've engineered synthetically. If it's safe for long-term consumption, this could solve every food crisis humanity has ever faced in space colonization. The room fell silent again. Jace, arms crossed, still wasn't convinced. Or, he muttered, it could be the best damn bait trap ever set. Sienna turned to him. You always this paranoid? He shot her a look. I'm alive, aren't I? Elias sighed, rubbing his temple. Jace had a point. Whatever this was, it was too perfect. If some unknown intelligence had left it here, they needed to be absolutely certain of what they were dealing with. Sienna seemed to sense his thoughts. Look, she said, we're not saying anyone should just start snacking on alien fungi. But we do need to push further. We have to understand who did this and why. Elias nodded. Agreed. But we need to be careful. Let's run deeper simulations before we take any risks. The first experiment. Hours later, after endless deliberation and safety checks, the test was ready. Inside the biocontainment chamber, a synthetic digestive simulation unit, a machine designed to mimic the breakdown of food in the human gut, had been prepped. Sienna stood by the control panel, adjusting the parameters. This will simulate the full digestive process, breaking the spores down as if they were consumed by a human. If there's anything dangerous, neurotoxins, mutagenic properties, it should show up in the analysis. Elias stood behind her, arms crossed. Do it. With a single press of a button, the experiment began. Inside the chamber, the spores were subjected to enzymatic breakdown, acids dissolving their outer shells, proteins unfolding at a microscopic level. The team watched in tense silence, the data streaming in real time. Then, something unexpected happened. The spores didn't just break down. They adapted. Sienna's hand hovered over the console. What the hell? Elias leaned closer. What are we looking at? Callum's eyes were wide. There, self-correcting. On the screen, the spores responded to the simulated digestive process, their molecular structure adjusting itself, altering its breakdown speed and composition, as if they were learning. Sienna's breath hitched. That's not normal. Elias clenched his jaw. No, it's not. Jace muttered under his breath. I really don't like this. Then the final result came through. Sienna read it, her hands trembling slightly. There, nutritionally perfect, she whispered. The silence stretched for a long moment. Callum turned to the group, his voice quiet. Someone made this for us. The implications. As the team stood in the glow of the monitors, the weight of their discovery settled in. This wasn't just an alien food source. This was a gift, a warning, or a test. Elias knew one thing for sure. Humanity wasn't alone. Something, or someone, had left this behind. And whoever they were, they had been expecting humans to find it. The hidden architects. The eerie glow of the lab's monitors cast flickering shadows against the stark white walls of Echo Base, but the tension in the room had little to do with the dim lighting. The team stood frozen, their minds racing through the implications of the latest discovery. This wasn't just an alien plant. It was something more, something designed with humans in mind. Commander Elias Carter turned away from the display, his mind reeling. The implications were terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Let's get one thing straight, he said, his voice breaking the silence. This isn't a coincidence. Something, or someone, put this here for us to find. Dr. Sienna Holt leaned against the workstation, arms crossed, still staring at the screen. "But why?" she murmured. "This level of bioengineering, it's too advanced for any natural evolution. Whoever created this had an understanding of human biology before we ever set foot on this planet." Lieutenant Jace Monroe exhaled sharply from his spot by the door, shaking his head. "That's the part I don't like. It's one thing to discover alien life. It's another to find something that was tailor-made for us. We're not just visitors here. We're being expected." A chill ran through the team. Elias turned back to Dr. Callum Rice, the xenobotanist. Could this be some kind of terraforming experiment? Maybe a lost human expedition? Callum frowned, rubbing his chin. Highly unlikely. We've been monitoring XO9 for decades. No records of prior manned missions, and nothing in the planet's data suggests any human influence before now. Sienna added, "Besides, even if it was human-made, it doesn't explain why the spores are still adapting in real time. This kind of biological engineering is centuries beyond what we're capable of." Jace shifted uneasily, his eyes scanning the lab as if expecting an unseen observer. "Then we're dealing with something non-human." The words hung heavy in the air. An ancient message. Elias knew they were at a turning point. If this truly was a gift, a warning, or a test, they needed to understand its purpose. "All right," he said, straightening. "We need answers. Rias, Holt, what's our next step?" Sienna sighed, glancing at Callum before answering. "If we want to know where these spores came from, we need to track them to their source. If they're growing in one area, chances are they're connected to something bigger, maybe an underground network, maybe a biological machine, maybe even something sentient." Callum nodded. "We also need to run deep structure analysis on the genetic code. If there's any trace of a repeating pattern, any data sequences embedded in the spores, it might tell us if this is more than just food." Elias nodded. "All right. Get to work." Sienna and Callum immediately got to their consoles, their fingers flying over the holographic interfaces. Jace, still skeptical, muttered under his breath as he checked his weapon. "You know," he said, voice low, "we're assuming that whoever made this had good intentions." Elias glanced at him. "You think otherwise." Jace let out a dry laugh. "I don't believe in free meals, Commander. If you were an advanced alien species and you suddenly found a bunch of hungry primates running around in space, what would you do?" Elias frowned. "Depends on whether I wanted to help them or control them." Jace smirked. "Exactly." Before Elias could respond, Sienna gasped. "Commander, look at this." The display flickered, showing a magnified section of the spore's genetic sequence. But this wasn't just random DNA. This was something else. Something structured. A message. "That's a pattern," Callum whispered. "A repeating sequence of symbols embedded within the spore's molecular structure." Elias stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Are you saying this is language?" Sienna nodded slowly, her face pale. "Not just any language. It's binary code." Jace's jaw tightened. "Like a damned signal." Callum hesitated, adjusting the display, running deeper scans. "No, not a signal. It's more like a blueprint. Instructions." Elias narrowed his eyes. "For what?" Callum's voice was almost inaudible. "Something not human." Following the trail. Within hours, they had traced the source of the spores to an area 6 kilometers west of Echo Base. Satellite imaging showed a region where the fungal growth was denser, forming a spiral-like pattern that stretched across the valley floor. A perfect spiral. "This isn't natural," Jace muttered as they examined the images. "I don't care what anyone says." Elias made the call. "We're going in. Gear up. We leave in 20 minutes." The journey to the site was unnerving. The closer they got, the more unnatural the terrain became. The ground felt softer, the air thicker with a strange energy, almost as if the very planet itself was watching them. When they arrived at the site, they found something that made their blood run cold. At the center of the spiral, half buried beneath layers of alien growth, was an artifact. It wasn't a rock formation. It wasn't natural. It was machinery. A massive metallic structure with strange, glowing runes carved into its surface, pulsing faintly with light. The fungal spores originated from inside it, spreading outward in deliberate, symmetrical growth patterns. Jace exhaled. I knew this wasn't just some weird plant life. Sienna ran a scanner over the structure, eyes wide. This thing is millennia old, maybe older. Elias stepped forward, his pulse hammering. Can we open it? Callum hesitated. Possibly, but we don't know what's inside. Elias clenched his jaw. We came all this way. We have to know. Sienna exchanged a glance with Callum, then nodded. All right, give me a minute. She keyed in a sequence on her scanner, sending resonant frequency pulses into the artifact. Slowly, the symbols on its surface began to shift, rearranging themselves. The team stepped back, weapons ready. Then, with a low mechanical hum, the artifact came to life. The metal surface split open like an ancient vault, releasing a low, pulsating glow. The fungal spores reacted immediately, retracting as if afraid. A dark chamber was revealed inside. And at the very heart of it, something moved. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, its form flickering between solid and translucent, watching them. Elias' breath caught in his throat. Sienna whispered, her voice barely audible. Commander, we're not alone.